At this time, would any committee member wish to remove any items from the consent agenda for separate discussion? Seeing none, may I have a motion to approve the items listed on the consent agenda?
So moved.
May I have a second? I have a motion and a second. Any further discussion on the motion? All those in favor, please say aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Motion carries unanimously. We have one item on today's discussion agenda, a presentation from the Public Policy Institute of California on the role of higher education in California's future. We are pleased to have here today from the PPIC, Dr. Hans Johnson, Senior Policy Fellow and Higher Education Center Director. Dr. Johnson, welcome, and please begin your presentation.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chancellor White. It's a pleasure to be here. I am shooting for the bronze star here. I will try to be brief, but there's an important story to tell here, and I'll go through it as quickly as I can.
We've made up some time, so don't need to feel like you have to rush through important discussion.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So PPIC, for those of you who don't know, is a private, not-for-profit research institution. We're based in San Francisco with offices also in Sacramento. And our focus is on improving public policy to improve the lives of Californians. And quite a few years ago, we started a series of projects looking at the future of our state. And one area stood out to us as perhaps the biggest challenge facing California. And that's what I'm going to be speaking about this morning. And that challenge is that our economy is increasingly requiring more highly skilled and more highly educated workers. And yet our population, and yes, our higher education institutions, have not been able to accommodate that increasing demand. And so what we'll talk about here is some work we've done in trying to understand the nature of that challenge and how we might meet that challenge as a state. And we'll focus eventually on the California, very important role of the California State University, which is one reason why it's a great pleasure for me to be here. One is you are, as you already know, the most important university segment in California by virtue of numbers, certainly, educating far more Californians than any other segment with respect to a bachelor's degree. And in fact, as you know, also the largest university, public university in the United States. So there's two parts to this presentation. First of all, I'm going to give you kind of a little bit of a picture of where we are right now in California with respect to public opinion. And then I'll turn to specifically this economic and higher education challenge. So the good news on the public opinion front is that Californians hold their higher education institutions in high regard. In our November 2017 statewide survey, we found that about 2/3 of Californians identified each of the systems as doing an excellent or good job. And I should note that very few said not so good or poor. There were a number of unknowns in these responses. And you see that the systems have fairly similar and almost statistically significantly similar results. This is good news. It's also a bit of a challenge, I think, especially for CSU, in that when we look at outcomes for students and we look at the role that this institution plays, it is rightly regarded favorably by many Californians, but it's not a universal opinion. And I'm going to get to some nuances of this in a bit. But the good news is strong of public opinion, very favorable, much higher than any other kind of sector of government service, and certainly higher than even our governor, who's very popular, higher than our legislature, and far higher than Californians' attitudes about Congress and about the president. We're nonpartisan. Just report the numbers. But there is a disturbing, I would say a disturbing trend that we observed in our latest survey, and that is that Californians are less certain about the value of college today than they were 10 years ago. And this mirrors findings in national surveys of all Americans. And then you'll see there on the far left, we went from about 2/3 of Californians saying that college is necessary for a person to be successful in today's work world. To today, only about half of Californians say that, and you'll see declines for every race and ethnic group. To be clear, there are ways to succeed without going to college. That is the case. I will show you some numbers in a bit that show that your chances of succeeding are far, far higher if you go to and graduate from college than if you don't. But this decline in the share of people saying college is necessary, I think needs to be unpacked a little bit. And specifically, what we have found is that Californians increasingly are concerned about the affordability of college. And again, here, I think there's an important story for CSU and UC, and certainly the community colleges to tell, that is not necessarily widely known among Californians. Most Californians do not think college is affordable. Many Californians believe that low-income residents of our state have poor access because of unaffordability. And as you know, certainly there are concerns in that regard, but through the Cal Grant and institutional grants, low-income and even many middle-income students do not pay tuition at the University of California or the California State University system. And I don't think that is widely known among Californians and even among parents of children in California schools. So let's turn a little bit to current political opinions. Interestingly, a large share of Californians say that gubernatorial candidates' positions on higher education are very important to them. But I must note that when we ask some basic questions about the division of responsibilities between the systems, whether Californians have ever heard of the master plan, for example, knowledge is not especially strong. And so I'm not sure how much they know about the gubernatorial candidates' positions on higher education. I'm not sure I know how much variation there is among them. Everybody's for higher education. I think the big issue is how you afford it and how you get to where you want to be. At the same time that they say this is very important to them, only 8% of Californians cite education, both K-12 and higher education, as the most important issue facing the state. As I noted earlier, their primary concern with higher education is not the quality of higher education, it is affordability. And they, I would say, rightly respond that state funding is inadequate. Again, an overwhelming majority, 2/3, say that. And yet when we ask Californians what we should do about it, there is not a lot of consensus. 74%, well, there's consensus, oppose tuition increases. An overwhelming share of Californians oppose tuition increases. They do support a state bond for construction projects, almost 2/3. Certainly this portends well for any future higher education bond act. But when we ask them, well, would you be willing to pay more taxes to provide more funding for higher education? It's about evenly split, almost 50-50. Finally, from our public opinion survey, we find that demand for college is quite high. And there's a lot of different ways of measuring it. Here we ask Californians what their aspirations are, educational aspirations are for their children. And you'll see that 85% of Californians reply, these are parents of California students, reply that they want their child to at least earn a bachelor's degree. And in fact, a majority say they would like their children to earn a graduate degree. We certainly know by many other measures that demand for higher education is quite high in our state. All of you know the number of applications that you receive, improvements in high school preparation that have led to record numbers of students completing the A through G college preparatory courses, and increases in students taking and passing AP exams, for example, are all indications that there's not only strong aspirations on the part of their parents, but strong demand on the part of students. And just to again back up and put this in kind of a 30,000-foot view, you should be very happy about that. I know it's a challenge to try to accommodate that increase in demand and afford that enrollment, but there are many states where attracting students is a problem. And again, this is partly a result of the demography of California being very different than the demography in much of the United States. So now let me turn to some of the work we've done specifically looking at this challenge of California's future economy and the role of higher education in responding to that challenge. We've done projections of the state's economy and population that show that, looking at the far right-hand set of bars here, that by 2030, almost 40% of jobs in California will require a bachelor's degree, and I'd be happy to answer questions about what we mean by that later. Whereas our population and higher education institutions are on a pace to only produce a workforce in which about 1/3 of adults have at least a bachelor's degree. So this difference of a little over 5 percentage points equates to a gap of 1.1 million workers. At PPIC, we call that the workforce skills gap. In Sacramento, I think it's more commonly known, and it is commonly known as the degree gap. So let me talk a little bit about the economic side, and then I'll talk about the population side. First, our economy in California, as the economy in the United States and throughout the Western world, and in fact throughout the world in general, is increasingly demanding more highly educated workers. Our projections are actually a continuation of longstanding trends that California's economy is going to be increasingly demanding more highly educated workers. We look at a mix of industry and occupation projections to determine these skills and educational attainment levels. If anything, I think we might be fairly modest in our projections that about 38% of jobs will require at least a bachelor's degree by 2030. Importantly, as we do this work, we look at whether employers are really valuing these degrees. And certainly, and let me be clear, I know we're focusing a lot on labor market here. Partly that's because there are good numbers there, but it's also largely because most Californians and most California students cite better careers as the main reason why they are going to college. And certainly this is of primary importance to the state and state policymakers as they think about our state's economic well-being and the economic well-being of individuals. So that's why we're focusing so much on labor market outcomes. Certainly there are others we could talk about with respect to higher education, including health benefits, voting, and other kinds of civic participation measures. So getting back now to our labor market, we observe that employers in California highly value college graduates. On average, the wage gap between college graduates and people with less education has grown tremendously over the last few decades, and it is at or near an all-time high. That wage gap has leveled off. It's still increasing, but slower than it has in the past. But realize, and I think this is something else that's kind of out there in public perception. I think a lot of people think, oh, I have a nephew who works at Starbucks and he majored in history at Cal State East Bay, so college wasn't worth it. Over the lifetime of that individual, it's unlikely that he or she will remain working in that job, and we've done some work I'll show you in a bit that looks at some lifetime measures of the economic advantage of higher education. But the main story is when we look at educational attainment and earnings in California, that difference between a bachelor's degree and a high school graduate is at an all-time high. And here you see the numbers reflected for the most recent year that we had data for, which was from the 2016 American Community Survey. So that was kind of the demand side. Now let's look at the supply side. And the supply side, there's a pretty simple answer. This shows how we get there. But on the supply side right now, given California's current rates of transition, and I'm following here 1,000 ninth graders all the way through to earning a bachelor's degree or not. Out of 1,000 ninth graders in California at current rates of transition in terms of completing high school, then going on to college, and then completing college, only 305 will earn a bachelor's degree. So this is among recent high school graduates. We allow them 6 years to transfer. If they're a transfer student, we allow them then 4 years to finish their bachelor's degree. So for that group of students, we're following for 10 years. For those who graduate from high school and then go directly into college, we're looking at 6-year graduation rates to come up with these numbers. We actually developed these estimates to include any college in the United States. So there were some assumptions there, but the main story here is that California has done a pretty good job at getting students into college. You'll see out of those 823 high school graduates out of that initial cohort of 1,000 ninth graders. So we lose about 170, 180 students who don't graduate from college. Then we have well over 600, about 650, who actually, out of that 823, who do go on to college. So this is a pretty good college going rate. Nationwide, we rank 5th in the country in the share of recent high school graduates who go to community colleges, 5th among the 50 states, so very, very high reliance on community colleges. We rank, to me, shockingly, 47th in the country in the share of recent high school graduates who go on to a four-year college or university. And this is partly because our master plan eligibility standards, which were set 50 years ago, have not been updated. So we still have the top 1/8 and top 1/3, with a caveat about the top 1/3 for CSU, given the recent eligibility study. But in any event, California as a state, not necessarily by design, partly by design, but also partly by where money has been most available in higher education, which is in the community colleges, because they're a part of the Prop 98 guarantee, and UC and CSU are not. We have focused a lot more on community colleges than other states. And so then this little box here that shows that transfer roll is of critical importance in California. I was just at a hearing yesterday in Sacramento testifying about the importance of transfer. And if there's one, when certainly it's true numerically, the largest single obstacle to completing and earning a bachelor's degree is that transition from community college to four-year colleges. And then after that is actually getting students who are in the system to finish. If we could make major headway in both of those areas, we would go a long way towards closing this education skills gap. The other big demographic challenge in California is that our population is aging. So this shows you the change in California's population projected by age group from now to about 2030. And you'll see tremendous increases in our older population. This, of course, is the baby boom. And it's not only that the baby boom will be exiting the labor market as they hit these ages and already have started to hit these older ages. It's also that the baby boom is the best educated cohort in California history among retirees, with almost a third of baby boomers having earned a bachelor's degree. This is the first time in the history of California, and in fact, we have similar numbers in the nation, the first time in the history of the nation that we have had such a well-educated cohort exiting the labor market. In the past, older retirees tended to be less well-educated. They were young in a very different era when going to and completing college was quite uncommon. So the baby boom is that first generation. They experienced the GI Bill. They went to college in pretty big numbers. They completed college at fairly high rates. And so not only are there a lot of them, there are a lot of very highly educated baby boomers. So this is what is driving a lot of the demographic challenge we face as a state in terms of trying to replace these workers with more highly educated young adults. And then finally, in terms of thinking about this in terms of lifetime wage differences and the value of higher education, one question I almost always get asked is, well, sure, that might be true for an engineering major, but it's not true for a liberal arts major. And the answer is no, it's true for every major, that gain, economic gain, is seen across a spectrum of majors. Certainly, we see engineering and computer science being at the top, that the wage difference, and this isn't actually just the wage difference, we're actually looking at the difference in lifetime wage income, taking out of this for the college students how much it costs them to go to college, including the opportunity cost of lost wages while they were in college because they couldn't be working full-time while they were in college. And even for the major that's at the bottom of the list here, education, even those majors earn about $250,000 more over their lifetime after subtracting the cost of going to college than people who simply graduate from high school. Okay. And so then finally, we've done a lot of work looking at then how we close this gap. And I'd be happy to answer questions about this in more detail. But for each of the segments, we've identified what share of this 1.1 million degree gap, that's the far top right-hand corner in this table, would be necessary for each system to produce to close the gap. And you'll see the incredibly important role of the California State University system by nature of your sheer size. The challenge for you is to increase the number of bachelor's degrees above our business as usual scenario by almost 500,000 over the next 15 years. And I am pleased to report that of all the segments, the California State University, I think, has responded most strongly to this challenge under the leadership of Chancellor White. And so I thank you for hearing this message. He's heard this talk many times, but I thank you for hearing this message and for PPIC being able to play a role in helping inform your ambitious efforts to close this degree gap. So there are three ways that we've identified that this gap can be closed. These are just really kind of deterministic. You can either enroll more students, or you can graduate more students who are already in the system. And among enrollment, you could either do that through first-time freshmen or through transfer students. And the answer to how we're going to get there is all of the above. We need some of each one of these needles to move, and to move fairly substantially. The California State University, as you know, has adopted their Graduation Initiative 2025 goals, which align very, very closely to what PPIC has argued is necessary in terms of improving completion rates at CSU. And in fact, let me just show you. Here is what we've recommended for the closing the gap targets for CSU. You see the graduation rate when we developed this was about 57%. That's the bottom row there. And our closing gap target for 2030 was 74%. Your target for 2025 is 70%. That is actually puts you directly on line to reach this 74% by 2030. So this is fantastic. And in fact, there's good signs. And we're 2 years into our projection period. And so far, you are above our trajectory and your own ambitious trajectory for meeting that gap. So meeting that goal. So keep up the good work there. The other components we talked about were increasing the number of transfer students. The California Community College System and their Visions for Success has adopted an increase of 35% in their goal for transferring students to CSU and to UC over the next 5 years. That aligns completely with PPIC's targets that we've identified. I was actually a part of their advisory group on their Vision for Success and was pleased they adopted that number as well. Again, very ambitious. But at yesterday's hearing, I produced a slide that showed that CSU is actually right on target already. It's only 2 years in, so we have 3 more years to go with ambitious increases going forward. But you are on target there as well. And then finally, with respect to eligibility shares, we recommended increasing the share of students, first-time freshmen eligible, first-time freshmen from California high schools eligible for CSU from top 1/3 to 40%. We did this before there was a new eligibility study done. I don't know how many of you know the results of the eligibility study that was done by the state? So that eligibility study looked at California high school graduates and found that, lo and behold, about 40% of California high school graduates are actually meeting the CSU eligibility criteria right now. So you already met it, and we didn't even know it until that eligibility study was done. So that's actually fantastic news as well. So these are a number of really strong and positive indications of movement in the right direction. I will say that those early gains are probably some of the easier ones to be had. And right now, from my perspective, the central issue facing you and facing the state is whether you're willing to accommodate the additional enrollment that's necessary to get us where we need to be and to take the actions that are necessary to ensure that students are succeeding. And from my perspective, you are doing that. The graduation initiative, remedial education reform, I believe are steps in the right direction. These are things that we've been arguing for. The central challenge now, honestly, is the budget. And in Sacramento, and I think it's no surprise that UC and CSU were not, from my perspective, fully funded to be able to accomplish the goals that we've identified we think are necessary for the state. And I was just at a meeting with some community college officials the other day who, partly because of their Prop 98 guarantee, noted that it was a great time for them to celebrate the budget. And certainly you don't hear a lot of discussion at UC or CSU about celebrating the budget right now. So the central challenge, and I know Kathleen Chavira is here and she does great work in Sacramento, but the central challenge is finding your, and again, we're not advocacy. We do push for what's good for Californians, and certainly more enrollment of California students in our higher education systems and the CSU is central and something we've argued for. So the central challenge now, I think, in Sacramento is figuring out how to respond to the governor's proposal and move forward so that you're able to meet the goals that you have established for yourselves as an institution and that will serve California and at the end of the day, improve the lives of individual Californians so that they are able to achieve the California dream, that we're able to ensure that higher education continues to serve as a ladder of social and economic mobility. I believe that is the central challenge facing higher education in the United States and certainly in California. CSU has an incredible track record of enrolling a diverse population with many students from underrepresented backgrounds, low income and first generation students. That story is one that needs to be out there fully, and that you've done a good job at making higher education as affordable as possible. So thanks for listening to this presentation and all the good work you're doing. And if there's time for questions, I'd be happy to answer any.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Appreciate you being here and sharing this research with us. I know I've always looked forward to the PPIC reports, so it's great to put a face with a name, and I'm sure my board colleagues are. So I'm noting I have some questions, but I'll hold mine till the end. I've got Lily, Peter, Jane, Hugo. Who am I missing? Becky. I had trustee in front of all those, of course. So we'll start with trustee Taylor.
Hans, a couple of questions. First off, clearly this board is 100% invested in the goal of graduating more, without a doubt. And as you stated, we've made good progress, and I think we'll continue to make good progress. On the issue of enroll more, I don't see how it happens. And help me understand how on earth we can possibly afford, under the current budget scenario, we have a hard time educating the students we already have, much less enrolling more. And I do worry that in that two-part solution, as you talk to legislators, they might think, oh, great, CSU can do this without more money. We're likely going to be under a scenario where we actually have to cut enrollment in order to continue to maintain some measure of quality of undergraduate education. So I do worry about some of your projections up there. We're going to try to graduate more of them, no doubt, but I don't think we can get up and sustain a 40% eligibility because the states never give us an indication, A, they want to, and B, they can afford it. Am I missing something in that conversation?
Yeah, so let me respond first of all in two ways. So first of all, it does turn out that you have been, not entirely, but mostly accommodating 40% right now. So
Hans, our facilities are falling apart. We can't continue to do that without funding.
Right.
Just plain and simple.
Right. So okay. So the first part was the 40% has already been reached. So that's actually history. The second part, which is, okay, how do you fund it and make sure that you're able to get students through in a timely basis and have the facilities you need? Certainly, it's a huge challenge. But realize, historically, when California was faced with a tidal wave of young adults, a much greater challenge than we face today, the state and its leaders and its higher education systems came together. They developed the master plan. I realize this is 50 years ago. It was a different era, but there are, in fact, political and budget decisions that are made today and will be made tomorrow in Sacramento that could change the course of our future. And that, I think, is one of the messages we have. I'm giving it here, I give it in Sacramento, is if we don't do that, then we will end up with a state that's less educated. We will end up with a state that has more demands for social services. And most importantly, we'll have a state where economic divides and inequality become more firmly entrenched than they are now. So I know that's rhetoric. So now let's get down to what you do budgetarily. Because this is something controversial that it's controversial.
Hans, you recognize that 50 years ago the state was such a dramatically different place. Since then, Prop 98, massive increases in pension and healthcare liabilities, huge increases in Medicaid funding, gigantic increases in corrections, environmental. The state's a different place.
It is a different place.
People came together back then because they had more flexibility. What I'm worried about is fundamentally the state's financing structure doesn't allow them to invest in organizations like us. And I think that's the message PPIC needs to deliver, that unless they fix that, we're going to be nibbling around the edges.
And we have talked about that. So certainly when you look at the state's discretionary budget, it's smaller than it's been because of decisions that state residents have made. So Proposition 98, for example, where the community colleges, and we have another chart, I don't know if I brought it with me, that shows the share of general fund allocations that go to the different systems. And over time, I'm sorry, I didn't bring it, but over time, when Prop 98 passed, it was roughly, not quite, but it was almost a third. 1/3 to UC, 1/3 to CSU, and 1/3 to the community colleges. Today, over half of all general fund allocations from the state go to the community colleges. And in recent budgets, it can be as high as 70% of additional funding is going to the community colleges. It's because they're a part of the Prop 98 guarantee. And look, I don't run political campaigns, I don't run propositions, but I think there's a lesson there for UC and CSU, whether you're able to motivate political action or want to, that probably isn't necessarily your role, but unless that happens, I agree, the current structure doesn't work. So what do? In the past, people who have seen that structure changed the structure. The K-12 system and the community colleges changed the structure.
Did you talk to him before that ahead of time? Did you plant that?
Hold on. The other item that you could do, and again, you saw this is not popular publicly, but you can raise tuition. And you can raise tuition and hold low income and even, again, middle income students harmless. And if the trade-off is very clear, either there's a spot for you in college or not, the vast majority of Californians would choose that spot. So most parents, when they're upset with UC or CSU, it's because their kid didn't get in. And even more so, when their kid did everything that they were supposed to do in terms of the eligibility criteria for UC and CSU, and then they didn't get in. Or in UC's case, they got redirected to UC Merced, which is the only campus that will now take students who are minimally UC eligible. And that causes a lot of concern. So if you said to that parent or group of parents, or putting it in a different way, the constituents of state legislators, if we raise tuition and hold middle income and low income students harmless and are able to accommodate fully the number of students who are eligible for UC and CSU, that's a good win for the state, and it's actually a good win for those students, because even with raised tuition, CSU is still a bargain. I mean, if you look at CSU tuition compared to any other institution, UC, most public universities in other states, CSU is actually still, even with the tuition increases you've experienced, a pretty good deal. I know that's controversial. I know it's not popular, but that's another way out.
You're certainly preaching to the choir on that point. So I have a number of trustees who'd like to speak, just for cognizance of the time. Trustee Kimbell and Trustee Carney following.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Johnson. I really look forward and study your reports. I was wondering if you could shed some light on some of the contradictions within the data. What do you attribute this view, particularly among white Californians that a college education isn't as valuable now as it was 10 years ago, when the data shows, this incredible gap between college grads and non-college grads and how much money they earn over a lifetime. And then also, while the majority think we're doing a good job, and they don't want us to raise tuition, they don't want to pay any more taxes for it. And perhaps, I think social psychology is just proving that we human beings are just irrational animals. So could be that. But I'm just wondering how you think we as trustees and advocates, what can we do to convince, because my view is really it's the taxpayers that we have to convince that it's valuable and that they will be getting something back from this. And I really believe that. I think it's, an education sort of predistributes a lot of the goods, to our young people and the state. So how can you help us make the rest of California understand that?
So first on the value proposition, it's interesting to look at who is most dubious about the value of higher education. And I was surprised to learn that it's actually more highly educated Californians who are more dubious. And I think partly there might be a lack of self-awareness there. That is, I succeeded economically. I went to college, I graduated, but I'm so smart, I could have succeeded even if I didn't go to college. I think there's some of that going on. If you look at, for example, in that chart, it was the case that Latinos are the group that are most likely in California to say that college is necessary. Again, there's been some decline, and I'll talk about the decline next. But this is partly a reality of the labor markets that many Latinos face. In California, Latinos are much less likely to have graduated from college. So many, and in fact, if I have another breakdown by educational attainment, people who have not graduated from college are more likely to say it's necessary. So they're facing a labor market where they're trying to find jobs and livable wages without a college degree. They're finding it very hard to do so. And they're saying, yeah, a college degree is necessary. So partly, I think it's just a matter of where you sit and your own kind of self-reflection. The decline, I think, almost certainly is due to concerns about the cost of college. And that's where I think there is, again, a misperception. It is the case that the cost of college has gone up, no doubt. But because that has dominated so much of the public's thinking about higher education and the headlines in newspapers, anytime you raise tuition, it will be front page news somewhere in the state. Californians then start to think, well, a good job, yeah, that's important, but the cost of getting there, the cost of going to college is so high, I'm not sure it's worth the cost. So I think that's what's happening there. Then the second question you had, which was how we convince taxpayers to be willing to, or what we do about the conflict between voters in California saying they want more money spent on higher education but aren't willing to tax themselves. And this is something you see consistently across surveys, not just ours, in terms of almost any number of issues. People also want better health care, but they don't necessarily want to have to pay more taxes. And at PPIC, we've had a lot of discussion about who our audience is, who do we need to talk to about our policy research and our findings, and who do we need to persuade. And I think that my reflection in higher education is certainly the public's important. But at the end of the day, where we see the biggest changes historically or in other states with regards to higher education, it's actually been leadership that has led the people, has led voters, rather than voters leading the state leaders. So governors who are really concerned about higher education and legislators that are very concerned about higher education have made changes. And it is the case in California. There has been some renewed funding since the recession. Granted, I know that in the case of UC and CSU, the current picture doesn't look as bright. But many in California are thinking about the change in leadership that we have coming up in the governor's office and what that might mean for higher education. And I think there are some potential opportunities for higher education to have more visibility and more concern in Sacramento. At the same time, Trustee Taylor, I understand that there are restrictions on how much they can do under the current budget system. So I don't know if that's an adequate answer or not, but I think it takes leadership at the top to convince people that this is an important issue.
Thank you. Trustee Carney, then Trustee Eisen.
Thank you. And thank you very much for the great work of PPIC. We follow it. It helps us. Thank you.
Thanks.
I'd like you, if you would please, to talk a little bit more about the role of CSU and transfer students. I mean, Trustee Taylor's comments about, the funding difficulties and the fact that community colleges are in Prop 98, so they have more assured funding than we do. As I'm sure you know, we're roughly 60% transfer students, 40% first-time freshmen now. Do you think that in the future we're going to have to focus more on a higher percentage of transfer students just because of the way our three-tiered higher education systems work? And if so, how do you think we're doing on transfer pathways and the associate degree for transfer program?
Thanks. So as I noted, there was a hearing yesterday that I testified at that was about transfer, and of course the associate degree for transfer was noted, and the important role of CSU, as you've noted as well. To be clear, our projections in terms of that closing the gap scenario assumes that CSU and UC will maintain their current ratios of transfer to first-time freshmen. But you could get to closing that gap in many different ways. You could decide, okay, we're going to dramatically focus instead on transfer students. That would presume and require that the transfer pool be adequate in terms of size and preparation for transferring. And there are some dramatic changes happening in the community colleges that might make the next iteration of these projections suggest that the right way to go is to focus even more on transfer. So to be clear, right now we're not, and we haven't said that. But we've been doing a lot of work looking at developmental education, or also known as remedial education reform in the community colleges. I'm sure many of you have followed that those changes that are happening there. The short version of that is that some very substantive reforms are starting to be rolled out, and the potential for the number of students who will start successfully completing college-level gateway courses in math and English is tremendously large, and it could very well, and this is a project we're working on right now, and looking at this transfer volume and the potential transfer volume, it could create another tidal wave of demand for UC and CSU with respect to transfer. And I from a state perspective, that's actually the least expensive way, or could be the least expensive way to get a student through. Realizing though that right now students spend 4 years or more often trying to earn the appropriate credits to transfer. The associate degree for transfer program that you noted is, of course, a huge step in the right direction. And the number of degrees being earned in the community colleges is now in the tens of thousands compared to just about 1,000 maybe 5 years ago. So it's moving in the right direction. In my testimony, I noted, though, that it's uneven across colleges and across majors. So, for example, 111 out of the 114 community colleges have an associate degree for transfer in business administration, and almost all of the CSUs accept that, which is fantastic. At the other end of the spectrum, there are 0 associate degree for transfer programs in engineering. There are only a little over 30 in computer science. So there's some unevenness there, and there's some equity concerns with respect to that as well, given the diverse population that community colleges are serving. If they're not having those avenues towards some of the hard science and technology fields through the associate degree for transfer, that raises problems further on in the pipeline in terms of equity.
Thank you. Chair Ison, then Trustee Morales.
I just had a quick question about one of your slides that showed the 1,000 students and how many went on to a 4-year and how many went to the community colleges, and then from there on to the 4-year. If I'm reading this right, this is a fairly substantial portion of community college students who end up transferring to a 4-year college. I can't do the math quickly, but it's at least a third or so.
It's about 40%.
40%. And yet I heard recently, and I wish I could remember where I heard it, that some very small percentage of community college students actually end up going to a 4-year school, 8 to 10%, something in that range. So I don't know what the disparity is there, or if I just read it wrong.
No, you didn't. So let me tell you what the two numbers are. So this 40% is among recent high school graduates who go to community college. What share of them will transfer? And realize that recent high school graduates are just one population in community colleges. Recent high school graduates, when they go to community college, overwhelmingly identify transferring as their main educational criteria. But there's a whole other set of students who come into the community colleges every year, many older adults, who have less clear educational or vocational goals. Many of them will have vocational certificate goals. Some of them are there for adult enrichment courses. Others are there for English as a second language courses. Some of those older adults do want to transfer as well. So they're not actually in my pool right here. And so then if you look at all the students who come into community colleges, yes, it's only about 8 out of any entering cohort for any 1 year. It's only about 8 to 10% because of all those other populations that are being served. So I'm really trying to focus on this pathway from high school, from 9th grade really all the way through. And so I'm missing some of those very important buckets, which I acknowledge are really important functions of the community college, but tend not to include a very large transfer intending population.
Thank you. Trustee Morales, then Trustee Norton.
Yeah, in your answers to Trustee Carney, you said that you were not there yet, as far as I heard, in terms of suggesting that the community colleges would be perhaps the better route in terms of increasing graduation rates. And you say you were not there yet. Why the hesitation?
So the main reason for the hesitation, and to be clear, I certainly argue and believe and our numbers require that we dramatically improve this transfer pathway. But I would be hesitant to do so at the expense of limiting first-time freshmen or reducing first-time freshman enrollment. And there might be really, kind of out-of-the-box ways to do that, and let me mention those in a second. But the main reason why I'm hesitant is that the best research out there that looks at students who are otherwise academically equivalent in terms of their high school record, those who started a 4-year college are far, far more likely to end up successfully completing a bachelor's degree than those who go to a community college with the intention of transferring and earning that bachelor's degree. And of course, you could realize why that is the case. The more exit points you give a student, the more likely that student is to not make it to the next transition point. And secondly, when you go to a 4-year college or university, everyone there, at least all the undergraduates there, have the same goal. That's to earn a bachelor's degree. Whereas when you go to a community college, there are a lot of mixed and different goals, which again is their purpose, but it makes it, I think, more of a challenge. And certainly we see it numerically. It's a much greater challenge for students, otherwise equivalent students, academically from high school records to make it through. Another kind of the out of the box idea is that, and in fact, there are some examples of this, and it would be a way to deal with some of the cost problems would be for CSU or UC to admit a student with the requirement that the first 2 years they spend at a community college. In some ways, this is kind of the ADT, but it's actually a more early kind of ADT, so that a student could be accepted to CSU provisional upon completing a certain set of courses and unit requirements with a certain grade point average at a community college, and then be seamlessly, they've already been admitted, say. So they're already a CSU student paying community college fees, and then they make that transition. It's, again, similar to an ADT, but actually one roadblock less than an ADT. I don't know anybody else who's really advocating that, but it's something interesting to think about.
I have a follow-up question on your aspiration slide. I think you might have been commissioned to do for CPEC a similar study some 10 years ago about, which included a slide about aspirations. As I remember then, as a member of CPEC, the slide for aspirations for Latinos was around 80% for the children to go to college. Were you able to sample that aspiration question also with Latinos?
Yeah, so here it is for Latinos.
Okay.
And you see, and your very accurate memory, I was at CPEC about 10 years ago when there was a CPEC.
Right.
And it was about 80% then, and now it's just under 70%.
Yeah. To me, I think that's important considering the large number in the growing Latino population, which obviously has a great impact here on the CSU and California. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And to be clear, too, even though we see this decline across groups, these same individuals in our survey who are parents who, among those who were questioning the value of college, say that they want their child to earn a bachelor's degree or graduate degree. So even though you hear, and this is also consistent with the question about voters having conflicting points of view that aren't consistent, here again we see an inconsistency with increasing questioning of the value of college, and yet those same people will say, but even so, they want their child to earn at least a bachelor's degree, or more commonly, they'll say they want their child to earn a graduate degree.
Thank you.
Thank you. Trustee Norton, then trustees Nylon, Sebelius, and McGrory. That's what I have on my list.
First of all, I'd like to echo the sentiments of some of my colleagues that I appreciate the work that you've done. You mentioned that you had testified in Sacramento yesterday. May I ask before what legislative committee you appeared?
It was a Senate Select Committee on Student Success, chaired by Senator Glazer.
And your own candid assessment of how your message was received. Do you think that it was accepted and embraced, or did it seem to be falling on deaf ears, or did it fall somewhere in between on that spectrum?
So let me broaden that question. I have never been in a meeting with a legislator or legislative staff in Sacramento where they said, I came here to cut higher education.
No.
And in fact, there is in Sacramento, and Kathleen Shavira could tell you more about this, but there is a high amount of goodwill, just as we saw among the public, towards our higher education systems. The challenge for them has been when budgets are being cut during the recession, for example, there's not a lot of place for them to cut. And this goes to Trustee Taylor's comment. The K-12 and community college systems are part of the Prop 98 guarantee. In corrections, there are court orders, for example, with respect to overcrowding and providing health care. In social services, in some programs, there's matching federal funds. Higher education there's no constitutional right in California to a higher education. It simply doesn't have the budgetary protections that other components of our state budget does. But now, even though we've had some strong economic returns and some strong budget years, I think, again, we're nonpartisan, so I'll be as factual as I can be. The governor, in his press conference about the budget, was actually pointedly asked about the budget for CSU. Actually, it wasn't just UC, it was actually just CSU. And I'm paraphrasing his answer, but his response was pretty much along the lines of, they have plenty of money. And he even said something like, too much money can be a bad thing. So our governor has made it very clear where he is on this. I don't think our legislature is necessarily in the same spot. And Kathleen, I'm going to look for you to just nod or say no, whether you agree with that appraisal.
I would just remind folks of the advocacy work that we're doing, and we are getting a lot of receptivity from folks, but I think Hans is very appropriate in outlining some of the competing priorities that the legislature is trying to balance and that we continue to work with and try to find our place in. So,
Thank you. Trustee Norton, any further follow-up? No? Trustee Nylon and Trustee Sebelius.
Thank you, Vice Chair Day, and good afternoon, and thank you, Dr. Johnson. And again, we love this work, we love this information. This is just a real simple question, and maybe it's naive, but I think the reluctance that you're talking about with regard to the increased cost of tuition is real, it's palatable, and we see it not only in California but nationally. But some people, or maybe the explanation is not clear on why tuition has increased. It almost seems like it's being discussed isolated by itself, when the reality is nationally and statewide, the funding from government for higher education has dropped, and correspondingly to fill that gap is a tuition increase. So when you ask about tuition increase, do you ever ask the next push question that says, if you knew that the state of California, for instance, could reduce or hold flat tuition purely by increasing its appropriation to higher education, would you support that? Do you ask a question like that, or do you follow up? Because that's not only interesting information, it's also informational to the people who are being polled.
So we do ask, Californians would like the state to spend more for higher education. We then ask some of the questions that I noted there. They will say generally that they would like to spend more money on higher education, knowing that that might mean spending money on less money on other areas. But then if you actually, and I don't know that we've pushed this far, but this is not too much of a speculation. I think almost certainly if you ask them, well, would you rather take money from healthcare and spend it on higher education? You wouldn't see a lot of support for that kind of thing. And so I think it's these trade-offs that legislators have a difficulty making, that residents also would have a difficulty. If you ask them, should we take some of the state surplus and spend it on higher education, which we did not do, I would guess that you'd see a very large share saying yes, but I don't know that.
Yeah. I think that's the important question, because that's our environment today, not our environment of a zero-sum game. There's actually resources available for that activity. So that'd be an interesting question. And second of all, just to comment, this is very important information, but it's the kind of information that just frustrates you, right? It's like you have this brand new TV that's really big, and your child's telling you all about Netflix and all the great movies, but your Wi-Fi can't handle it. It's bandwidth, right? It's all about bandwidth. And what we're talking about is we have the great TV and we have the great Netflix, but we don't have the bandwidth to deliver the things that you're talking about that need to be delivered. And I think that really is the core issue. I mean, we talk a little bit about nibbling around the edges, and we can be better at a lot of things, but we cannot make the dramatic increases unless our bandwidth is increased. And I think that's really the message we need to have.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We have done reports looking at why tuition has gone up. It's as you know, it's exactly what you've found, that the tuition increases have served to not entirely replace lost funds from the state. We've done a study that looked at cost per degree. Look at that. CSU's, although there's a danger there too. I think, Chancellor, last time we talked, you mentioned this. CSU's cost per degree has gone down. So to us, this was kind of countering one of the arguments that we often hear, that the systems are inefficient. And CSU looks pretty good by that efficiency measure, maybe too good, right? Because there's a suggestion that you could continue to move that cost per degree down even more, or keep it at this very low level, which I know many of you regard as not sustainable. But there's lots of information out there that shows that our higher education systems have been trying to do more with less. that CSU has done as good or better job than any other segment. But at the end of the day, it's going to take political will.
A 5G economy on a dial-up infrastructure. Trustee Sebelius, then Trustee McGrory.
Thank you. I often now hear that times or the economies have changed. I don't think so, really. The attitudes have changed. The United States was and is by far the largest economy in the world. In size, it's as large as the 3rd to the 10th economy combined. Second is China, we know. Then comes Japan and Germany, pretty close together. Then comes the UK and France. In size, California is about the size of the UK, United Kingdom, and France. All these countries have free tuition. Higher education is free there. In some of those countries, Germany and the Scandinavian countries and several others, higher education is free not only for their residents, but also for international students. So granted, I understand that the percentage of college goers is higher in California. Europe has a more elitist vision to higher education, and the US, especially California, has a more aspirational vision in regard to access. And that is a good thing. But it is not a necessity that higher education is so expensive, but it's a collective choice that we made as a state and as a nation. And let me remind you, New York State has made community college education for free. So, you know, we always tell our students and we tell our institutions not to take no for an answer, not to hear that we can't do this. You know, we should have high aspirations. Well, you know, why don't we have high aspirations as a state as a whole? We have the money. We have the strength of the economy. We just need to have the collective will.
I do have, I mean, this is tangentially, but certainly related. This is actually, I think, one of the most powerful slides that I've seen when we look at the international context. So here I'm showing you the share of older adults. These are people who are, you know, on the verge of retiring, 55 to 64-year-olds. They're the blue line there, the blue bars. Their share that have at least a bachelor's degree or what's called a tertiary education. This is from the OECD. And then the orange bar are 25 to 34-year-olds, which is about 33% in California. So I'd shown you earlier that our ninth grade was led, you know, that ninth grade pathway led to about almost 31% to 33%. It's higher because of international and domestic migration that is heavily skewed towards highly educated residents from elsewhere moving here. But in any event, what you see there is that California actually has the highest blue bar, meaning among older adults. These were the master plan beneficiaries when it was first developed. We are the best educated place in the world. For younger adults, you'll see we're down near the bottom now. There has been some generational improvement, but it's mostly stalled out. Whereas places like Switzerland, Korea, Belgium, some big places like Poland and the United Kingdom have bypassed California by far, starting at a much lower base. So it goes to the heart of some of the comments you just made.
Thank you. Trustee McGrory, then Trustee Hinton. Am I missing anyone?
I think that was an excellent presentation, and I just want to commend the Policy Institute. I use your materials all the time in my classes. The research that's done by the Policy Institute is just top-notch, and congratulations on your great work. I think part of our problem here is that we are dealing with a state that has a financial system that just doesn't work very well. On the revenue side, it's almost exclusively dependent on personal income tax and sales tax. And on the revenue side, we've layered in a series of earmarks, such as Prop 98, that really hamstring the ability for us to get in there and get long-term commitments in terms of increased funding. So just on a state level basis, I hope your institute is taking a look at what could be done to try to reform the financial system. On your presentation, have you calculated out if we increase the number of graduates by 1.1 million, met your 1.1 million gap, what the tax revenue back to the state of California would be in 2030 from that increase in college graduates because they're making 2 and 3 times what a high school graduate makes?
We haven't, partly because the tax code and structure is pretty volatile. We could and probably should do, okay, given our current tax structure, what would that mean? So it would be a good exercise to do. I will note that the University of California has done a study, Henry Brady out of the policy school at the Goldman School at Berkeley, that looks at the long-term return to the state in terms of investing in higher education, and has found an order of magnitude. I think it was like for every dollar the state spends now over the long term, it will reap, I think, $4 or $5 or $6 in tax returns. I forget exactly what that number was. So something like that is out there, but we haven't done it.
I think those numbers would be good because it's a relatively short period of time, and it's kind of a real estate return on investment analysis. If we put the money in now, we'll double, triple, quadruple the revenues back into the state later on, and I think it's an argument that we can make for increased funding. The other part of the analysis that would be interesting is, have you looked at what will happen to the California economy in 2030 if we don't produce these 1.1 million graduates? What happens to the companies that are located here, the high-tech companies, the entrepreneurs that are here that rely on college graduates? What those constraints on the economy, can you quantify those?
Yeah, so the only way we've quantified it right now is that 1.1 million gap, and we've argued that we should close the gap rather than not close, and rather than spending a lot of time looking at what not closing the gap would mean. But having said that, it is already the case that we and others hear from employers that it's getting increasingly difficult for them to find the highly educated and highly skilled workers they need, even in today's economy, let alone 15 years from now. And we see some responses to that. One response has been an emphasis on trying to increase the number of H-1B visas, for example. And when we look at international migration to California, we see now that those international immigrants are the best educated they've ever been in the history of record keeping on educational attainment of immigrants. And then when we look at the domestic migration flows to and from California, even as the state has lost millions of residents to other states over the past 25 years, we have actually gained college graduates from other states. It's close to a net zero, but there's a small positive over that same time frame, which again is a reflection of the efforts of employers to attract the skilled labor they need from elsewhere because they aren't getting it from within California. So we've identified that as certainly a problem.
It would just, I think it would be helpful for us in terms of marketing what we're proposing in terms of increased appropriations from the state to know that in 2030 we'll have a $10 billion negative economic impact to the GDP of California if we don't produce these graduates.
Yeah.
If there's some way to do a calculation based on that.
I hear what you're saying, and I have some members of my advisory council here, including President Morishita, and we have members of our statewide leadership council and board here too. So I hear what you're saying, and we'll take it under advisement.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have Trustee Hinton. If I'm not missing anyone, then I will offer some concluding comments, and then we can move on. Trustee Hinton.
Great, thank you. Thank you for this presentation. It's a lot of useful information. But I just wanted to make a note that when we're talking about the cost of education, I often hear, and I heard it earlier, which is why I wanted to mention it, that California has one of the most affordable higher education systems, which is true. However, I believe it's incredibly important to be mindful of the other factors that contribute to the cost of education, that California has some of the highest tax rates and that we have one of the least affordable housing markets, which all really contribute to the accessibility and the affordability of education in California. And so I just think that because we have one of the more affordable higher education systems, it doesn't mean that we should just sit back compliantly and accept that fact. Especially as leaders in the CSU system, I think it's our responsibility to ameliorate the present circumstance for the constituents of California. So just keep that in mind.
Thank you. Other trustees, before I have a couple questions? So again, thank you, Dr. Johnson. Just a couple of questions. So 481,000 graduates over the next roughly 10 or 12 years, if I'm reading that correctly. That's roughly 48,000 per year. That's correct?
Yes.
So that's
although 2 years into the projections, it's not working. 2 years into the projections, you're actually on track.
But that is essentially a 50% increase over how many graduates we have per year.
So the actual, it grows over time. So in the near years, you're on track and it's not huge. I'm sorry, I don't have the precise number there, but in near years, it starts off, 5%, then 10%.
Okay.
And then in the out years, you're talking about a 50% increase over where you would have been.
Right. And then just if you go back to that Chair Eisen's slide on the 1,000 ninth graders, another way of looking at it, and correct if I'm wrong, but essentially what that slide is saying is that almost 50% of the college graduates every year are ADT transfers. Did I read
Right
that
now,
correctly?
so in fact, I heard in the hearing yesterday that almost half of your transfers are ADT students to CSU.
Well, but to your slide, half of our statewide college graduates are ADT transfers in that pool. You have 300 you show roughly 300 graduates per year, and 147 of them are ADTs.
Oh, sorry. For
Is that correct?
Yeah, so not all of those are ADTs. So many
but
community
50%
college
is a huge
students
number.
transfer without an ADT.
50% is a huge number.
Yeah.
So you're saying it?
So that 100. So we're trying to get there, but we can't. But on that 147 of those transfer students, those are students who are transferring from community colleges to UC, CSU,
right,
and other places.
And their success and persistence rate, if I remember, for other research,
is very high once they get there.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Sorry.
And then my last question: you spoke about the baby boomers and the bubble there. Do you have any data on kind of the I guess we're calling it the XYZ generations, right? How will those generations compare to the baby boomers in your scenario?
Yeah, so you'll from that slide there were population increases across the board for some of the younger cohorts, but they're small compared to the baby boomers. There was a kind of lag. I don't know that I should use the term slacker generation, but there was a generation where we saw educational attainment in terms of college completion drop below what baby boomers had done. And now this most recent cohort of young adults, and focusing on the 25 to 34-year-olds, because for a lot of students, as you know, it takes them till age 25 to make it to graduation. They're actually doing slightly better than the baby boomers did at their time. So there is, again, a very small amount of generational progress, but not enough. But certainly compared to the generation that preceded them, there's been some progress.
Right, as our chair just mentioned, those are the children of our baby boomers. So I've got 5 of them, and I can't keep them track which one's X, Y, or Z. But so there's optimism there.
Yeah. So and here's the chart that showed the change in the population. So the 25 to 29-year-olds are doing better than the 35 to 39-year-olds did, or the 40 to 44-year-olds did. So that's people in their late 30s were, for whatever reason, the least likely to have graduated from college.
Great. Thank you again. I want to, before we conclude this work, I want to make sure I give my colleagues one last chance. I don't see anyone jumping in. The copy of the presentation has already been sent. Check your emails. It's already been sent. Thank you, Ms. Kiss. Well, again, this concludes the work of the Committee of the Whole. I want to thank you, Dr. Johnson, and the PPIC for all of your hard work. We look forward to future reports and research and continuing the relationship and hopefully making it stronger with the CSU especially. So thank you very much.
Thank you.